Okay, good morning everybody, and welcome to this slightly long and very packed day about labor markets in the crisis. Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Now I think that we're going to kick this conference off on a maybe rather bleak note, but we hope that we can dim up the light during the day and get some good ideas and get a good debate going about what are the options and what are the ways of thinking in terms of European labor markets and how we can go forward from here on. So the day is dedicated to have a very open discussion, a very open debate about how labor markets are reacting to the crisis, to what extent labor markets themselves are in crisis, and what, if any, actions are needed in order to ensure that labor markets can pick up and break away from the deteriorating path it's on. So we hope to have an open debate. The day that we have constructed, as I said, which is rather ambitious and rather long, has a kind of logic to it. The logic is that the ETUI has over the past 4 years basically tried to keep a tab on what are the kind of issues that we need to talk about, what are the kind of challenges that both macro and micro challenges that we're facing, what are the kind of instruments that have been put forward to deal with these challenges and crisis, and what are their outputs or expected outputs, and what kind of path are they putting us on. Now, in the beginning of the crisis, I have to say that our research was worrying, but rather optimistic because we saw a genuine handling management of the crisis. Whereas from the onset of 2010, I think that the research became, the conclusions of the research became much more alarmist and worrying in terms of the change in the policy stance and the change in the direction of the European economy and the European labor markets in themselves. What we want to do is to discuss what alternatives we've put on the table, what alternatives that we have been discussing over the past years, but also what new alternatives that we can actually imagine over the next probably 10 years. Not to be pessimistic, but that's maybe the time horizon that we need to think on. So the day we've set up in 5 sessions. And it aims at building up the knowledge and the understanding, or rather misunderstanding in some cases, that we have on the situation of the labor market, that we have on what kind of prospects we have, and also hopefully on what kind of policy solutions that lay in front of us. We'll start out in this first session, which will basically set the scene for the remaining of the day. So it's the EU response to the Eurozone crisis and evaluation of prospects, gains, and costs. While many of the issues that we will discuss today are related to rather micro issues or microeconomic issues cannot function if the macroeconomic framework is not the right framework, or it's a framework going against what one is trying to do on a micro level. So one clearly needs to know exactly what the macroeconomic conditions are, what kind of macroeconomic policy options one is pursuing, and how this relates down to how labor markets can function, or rather should function. So the big question that this panel should try to head towards is, what, if any, are the economically plausible alternatives for correcting macroeconomic imbalances and restoring growth while minimizing the adverse effects on labor markets? So we would like, at the end of this panel, to have a very clear idea of what these alternatives are. We might not get them, but we hope that we'll get some hints or at least some debate going about what these alternatives could be. The next panel then will go to the core of the issue of the day, which is on the European labor markets in the parenthesis crisis. So unemployment is constantly on the rise. It has not decreased on a European average. But once again, once this is said, there's a huge discrepancy, a huge difference among the European countries in terms of their levels of unemployment and also very much in terms of their direction of unemployment. So the question that one needs to rise in this panel is with regard to what are the kind of trends we've observed, what are the kind of policy responses that have been put on the table to try to manage labor markets during the crisis, what has been the outcome, and can we learn anything from these lessons that we hopefully have learned to a certain extent. Especially the panel should try to answer the question, what policies, if any, are necessary in order to minimize the labor market cost of adjustment to the crisis. So very much hinged up to the first panel, but asking the question in a different way. The two following panels, which will be this afternoon, will look at two specific policy responses that have been put on the table. A lot of specific policy responses have been put on the table, but especially two are related to maybe more an issue of how labor markets should adjust in the crisis. The first panel will deal with the intra-EU labor migration. The intra-European labor migration has been put forward as a way of getting a better match between labor supply and labor demand, hence implying that in countries where there's very little labor demand, the workforce could see a positive. We could see a positive and efficient action by migration, where the migrants or the labor force then can move on to areas or to countries where the labor demand was at a higher level. So get a better match between demand and supply. So this panel will take a look at the trends. Once again, the lessons learned on labor mobility as an adjustment factor, both regard to the positive effects that one can expect from this, or one has observed from this adjustment, but also from on the negative effects. And the next panel, again, will be on the Eurozone crisis and its impact on collective bargaining. Once again, we have chosen to focus on a policy, a way of reacting to the crisis, which requires an adjustment in the labor market, namely on the price factor, namely on the wages. As we already know, there has been a huge pressure on collective bargaining, but also on industrial relations as a whole during the second half of the crisis. And the aim of the panel is to take stock of these current developments and to assess the results of the type of recommendations that are being put forward with regard to wage, with regard to industrial relations and the setup of collective bargaining, and try to see what is the overall objective with these recommendations, what are the overall outcomes of the type of reforms and policy stances that are being put forward, and also to see whether these recommendations actually can help to what they're supposed to do, namely manage the macroeconomic imbalances. Main questions to be raised in this panel is, should wages and hence collective bargaining be a part of the adjustment policies? Can this get us out of the euro crisis and help restore the labor markets? Or should we be looking elsewhere? Once again, we aim at having a very open debate, exchange, analysis, conclusions, and policy lessons. Now, to round up this kind of very rich day where we take a rather broad approach to what labor markets and the way that labor markets have adjusted, we will then hopefully end on a slightly less gloomy picture than we have here at the beginning of the day. And we will have a keynote speech by Laszlo Andor, the EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, who will come and talk to us about what are the issues that are being dealt with on the European level, what are the kind of proposals that one puts forward on a European level, and how can one actually relate to this. So actually the conclusions and the debates that we will have during the day, we will have a possibility to see how this matches up with some of the policy conclusions that one can expect from the European level. At the end of the day, then, finally, to conclude the conference, Bernadette Segol, Secretary General of ETUC, and Philippe Pochet, General Director of ETUI, will draw out the lessons learned from today and see what are the challenges, what are the policy options, and what are the kind of ways that we can actually think. So once again, I'd like to welcome you to today and hand the session over to Martin Mierens.